Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to what may or may not be the last session. I think it may not be. So we ended last week with this glorious tale of Jew hatred throughout the centuries with Martin Luther. I just want to set myself up a little bit here. Sorry, apologies. With Martin Luther and his trajectory from kindly understanding how the Jews could possibly not really see the truth of Christ to when at the very beginning and due to the Catholic Church to becoming the vociferous anti-Semite that he is unfortunately not famous enough for because he really was quite a stinker when it came to the Jews. I think that I read a few lines for you, but just for continuity, he finishes one of his essays on this. I believe the title was "On the Jews and Their Lies," in case anybody needed to be reminded of it. And he talks about ending it with, therefore be on your guard against the Jews, knowing that wherever they have their synagogues, nothing is found but a den of devils. Where you see or hear a Jew teaching, remember that you are hearing nothing but a venomous basilisk who poisons and kills people. Be on your guard against them. I'm sorry, who poisons and kills people merrily. Be on your guard against them. Anyway, that's the Reformation, and we're not going to dwell too much more on that period of time because I wanted to make a bit of a jump in time. And so the jump in time is going to take us to the Age of Enlightenment, and we'll talk about that. Now, Enlightenment, of course, as we all know, was really a Central and Western European phenomenon. I'm never exactly sure where to draw the line at Eastern Europe, but I know it's somewhere east of Berlin. And that was really in Prussia. It was really a Central and Western phenomenon. It's not that the Russians weren't aware of it, but it was a completely different world over there. And in fact, Polish Jewry by the late 18th century was now Russian Jewry, in some cases Prussian Jewry, and in some cases Austro-Hungarian Jewry, but the vast amount inside of Russia. And they were the largest Jewish population in the world, and therefore were kind of shielded from what was happening in Central and Western Europe, except when Napoleon tried to bring it to them. And we know what happened to Napoleon when he went a little too far eastward. That was not his best decision. Nevertheless, I see your comment, Rand. I happen to love that show. The Great on Hulu, if you're wondering what we're talking about. Nevertheless, the Enlightenment was an enormously important moment in Jewish history and also reflected a lot of the prejudices of earlier times as well. And we're going to sort of talk about them in an overlapping way. Without getting too deep into what hopefully you already all learned in university, even if you might have forgotten a little bit of it, just to remind you, we're talking about the 18th century, the late 18th and 19th century primarily. Certainly it started a little bit earlier, depending on where you looked and how you date it, but it gained steam in the 18th century, and it was into the 19th century that it began to really have the effect that it had. And it operated in different places in different ways, but none of these places were home to very many Jews. In Germany, for instance, the Enlightenment in some cases led to emancipation, and that became a major chapter in Jewish history. But you'll recall that what was then the sort of the misshapen remnants of the Holy Roman Empire had not really become Germany yet. And so it really depended where you were. Prussia did emancipate the Jews. Other duchies and city-states and so forth were much more backward. But it did help the Jews to be emancipated in the air of enlightenment that was going around. France, which had very few Jews, of course, became enormously influential, not just because of its philosophers, like Voltaire, who was very important, about whom I'll speak in a moment, but because the French Enlightenment was essentially exported through a number of wars, not the least of which was the Napoleonic War following the French Revolution. My favorite failed revolution of all time, I guess most people's. So their Enlightenment, it was praiseworthy in many ways, but it also came with a lot of anti-Semitic baggage, and it affected the Jews with a lot of hostility, a lot of prejudice. Now, you all probably remember the name Voltaire, his real name, which I never remember. Francois Marie Arouet was born in 1694, died in 1778. He had nothing especially against the Jews, and in fact was admired by Jews, but he didn't like the he didn't like the collective Jew. He didn't like the Jew that was part of a larger community, that saw him or herself as part of a nationalist, although that's a little bit of an anachronistic term at that point. It's starting to mean something, but didn't like that. So he was really, in many ways, filled with anti-Jewish ideas. And because he believed the Jews were tied to these, he was a bit of an anti-Semite himself, despite the fact that he was also a hero to a lot of Jews. This is how far and wide the Jews had to go to find a hero in those days. But he tended to view the Jews as a stand-in for all of his negative ideas, which I, as a humanist, am very attached to, as are many of us. But he saw the Jews as sort of a stand-in for all the worst in religion and dogma. Some say that he argued about Jews when he really meant the Catholics, because it was safer that way for him, especially given where he was living, where it was not at all that safe. But as I said, the Jews saw in Voltaire one of their best chances as an enlightener to move past anti-Semitism, which is why they wrote to him constantly. There's a whole bunch of correspondence. And indeed, as he became the proponent, the most prolific proponent of the Enlightenment in France, he formulated himself slightly better and spoke instead of the Jews in this way. He said, to the Jews as individuals, everything; to the Jews as a people, nothing. So this idea that the Jews could be a corporate entity and be of any value to anyone was negated. But then again, he wanted the same for the Catholic Church. The Jews, of course, had a different history, a different reason that they were attached to each other. Once the Republic had risen and stumbled with the takeover of Napoleon, who went to spread these values everywhere, Napoleon did himself, he saw himself as an enlightened person who wanted to bring emancipation, granted at the tip of a musket, to all of Europe. But he did something quite extraordinary in 1807. He asked his own Jews, whose emancipation he had suspended, waiting to secularize them more. Isn't it interesting how some of these things, you hear echoes of it in how France is dealing with its Muslim population today and how unsuccessful they are with it. But he basically said in 1807 to the Jewish communities over which he had some influence and governed, put together a Sanhedrin. You might remember that word from an earlier class. This was the Jewish legal tribunal. But he didn't mean it that way. He wanted a council of notables, of Jewish secular, or Jewish lay, I should say, Jewish lay leaders and of rabbis. And he formulated these very interesting questions, 12 of them, to try to figure out who the Jews were and how they might benefit from or be resistant to emancipation. And this was going to be the litmus test for what would then subsequently, at least he said it would be, an emancipation of the Jews under the lands that he was controlling. And remember, it wasn't a lot of Jews compared to what was back in Eastern Europe, but of course he had high hopes for it being more Jews than more of anybody else. And what's especially important for us to remember is that many of these Enlightenment attitudes wound up taking hold in a far off place that no Jew had ever dreamed of going to at this time, or few Jews ever dreamed of going to at this time, but which would, of course, become the place where the Enlightenment did finally bear real fruit for the Jews, and that's the United States. For all our other crap, the United States has always been relatively good for the Jews. So what were the kinds of things that Napoleon wanted to know? Well, we had some fun with this over many weeks in a class I used to teach, but so I have to give you the very abbreviated version. But I'll ask the questions, some of them, and you can sort of discern what he was going for. He asked, is it lawful for Jews to have more than one wife? He asked whether divorce was allowable. Is it allowed even in contradiction to the codes of French law, if it is? Does Jewish law permit a Jewish woman, I should have translated this better, to marry a Christian woman, or a Jew to marry a Christian woman, or may they marry only Jews? In the eyes of Jews, are Frenchmen who are not Jewish their brethren, or are they strangers? What type of conduct does Jewish law prescribe toward non-Jewish Frenchmen? Here's a good one. Do the Jews who are born in France and have been granted citizenship by the laws of France before he took power truly acknowledge France as their country? Are they bound to defend it, to follow its laws, etc.? Notice these are basically loyalty and assimilation questions. The answers, some of them are actually quite funny to read today. Jewish law clearly does not allow marriage between Jews and non-Jews. But they answered it in a very clever way. They said, you know, just as Catholic law requires that the people who enter into a covenant under Catholicism have to be bound by Catholicism to enter that covenant, so too do the Jews. However, we do not excommunicate those who marry others, and it is not in that sense against our laws. They wanted to know about the judicial power of rabbis. And if so, did it overrule the laws of France? Which, by the way, this is something that Talmudic rabbis had dealt with and had answered in a way that we still answer it, which is dina de malchuta dina, which is Aramaic for the laws of the land take precedence over the laws of of Judaism. Went on to ask whether Jews were prohibited from taking usury, whether Jewish law prohibited them from entering any professions, etc. So you can see what they were going for here, what Napoleon and his allies were going for here. And you can say that this is sort of a stage from formal anti-Semitism, formalized anti-Semitism, to a loosening and ultimately an emancipation, a loosening of those ties, and ultimately an opportunity for the Jews to become part and parcel of the civilizations in which they lived. Now, Germany had a lot more Jews, but Germany also, as I mentioned, was not one country. And so even as this took hold, it really didn't take hold in any kind of even-handed way. The most notable emancipation of the Jews, as I mentioned just a moment ago, was in Prussia. And it was Wilhelm III, who was the king of Prussia, and it was in 1812. He issued an edict concerning the civil status of the Jews in the Prussian state. It was, I think it was the largest of what would become the United Germany. And it really did extend a large measure of civil equality to the Jews. They had to give too. The Jews had to accept surnames, for instance. They had to adopt German in all of their non-religious and professional activities, and they had to agree to be conscripted. And then over the course of the next decades, there were a great deal more of the kinds of emancipatory edicts and so forth. There were also steps backwards as well, which we'll talk about actually a little bit when I get to American Judaism, because it affected them. So I'm going to skip over what happened in America on the anti-Semitism front, because we're going to get to that, although certainly not the worst of the stories. We know what was happening in Eastern Europe, and it was terrible. Even as emancipation and the slow dissolution of anti-Semitic laws were taking place there, the most significant changes in Eastern Europe were changes for the worse. At one point, when Poland was a country until the late 18th century, they had there a significant degree of autonomy. I mentioned it in passing in one of our classes. The Council of the Four Lands was an example of that, where they really did have the right to rule themselves. They were almost, if France had their three estates, the Jews of Poland were almost their own estate. They were not serfs. They were not subject to those kinds of rules, but they were also not nobility, although they aspired to be. They were kind of like landless, no, they weren't even landless, but they were kind of like gentry in England. You know, they had a lot of money, but no status. But they had their own rules and they could follow their own laws. That all ended with the takeover of most of the Jews by Russia. And it really led to an enormous amount of suffering for our ancestors who lived there. Some of whom we knew personally, maybe not you, Red, but a lot of us in the Zoom room knew some of these folks personally. They were our grandparents and great-grandparents. Jews were ultimately confined to what was called the Pale of Settlement, a very narrow area strip of land in what was and had been Poland, trailing down southward. The majority of Jews were not permitted to leave. Higher education was reserved only for very, very few Jews. It was an enormously oppressive existence. Poverty was rampant, and the Jewish population nevertheless continued to grow because religious orthodoxy of the ultra type that we now begin to recognize today, we call Haredim, that really began to set in. Unemployment was rampant. The Jews were highly dependent upon charity. Tiny numbers could live in Moscow or St. Petersburg, but only the very wealthiest, and only by essentially turning over gobs of their wealth to the government. Legal discrimination of the Jews continued throughout the 19th century, even as it is diminishing in the center and the west of Europe. It is continuing unabashed. England, which had an enormously anti-Semitic past, in the sense that they didn't actually have any Jews from 1190 till 1290 rather to the middle of the beginning of the Cromwell era, when they just sort of creeping in there at the end of the 17th century. Their growth in terms of accepting Jews was headed in very good directions. By the mid 1800s, they could even stand for parliament. The opposite entirely was happening back east. In the 1880s, after Tsar Alexander II was assassinated, he was considered a relatively enlightened czar. In 1881, anti-Jewish riots, pogroms as we call them, broke out everywhere and continued all the way up through the beginning of the revolution in Russia. There were some very notable ones, which we're actually going to mention again when we get to the history of Israel and America, because these both let loose, or these all let loose, massive waves of immigration, primarily to the United States, but enough to Israel that it was important to that small country's founding. Odessa pogroms, Warsaw pogroms, famously Kiev, and then the two worst, Kishinev and Bialystok. Kishinev and Bialystok led to more exoduses, massive exoduses. After the revolution, there were still some, by the way. There was another one in Kiev, another one in Lvov. But it should be no surprise to us, as we will see shortly, that 2 million Jews left Russia between 1881 and 1914, most of them coming to the United States. Many more would ultimately have left had they had the opportunity. It became increasingly difficult with the anti-immigration laws that the know-nothings and others put into place, which is, another reason why Jews today are very passionate about fair immigration laws. It was when the October Revolution finally entered Tsarist rule that Russian Jews were at least legally emancipated. It never ended Russian anti-Semitism. We know that despite massive Jewish support, mostly outside of Russia, for Stalin, I mean, some people in our congregation have told me about their parents being Stalinists back in the day. And ignoring or not or remaining unaware of it. But despite that kind of Jewish support, Stalin was terrible. You might have known about the doctor's plot and so forth. I can't get into all those details. Certainly you're aware of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which, by the way, if you look at QAnon, I wrote about this in our newsletter last week. QAnon is very much drawn from that, from the accusations in that. They don't specifically name Jews, but they don't specifically name Jewry, but they name Jews, prominent Jews everywhere. And everybody else always had its house Jews. So to say that there are Jews on the right is no excuse. But we know what that was, and it spread all around the world. It's never been out of print, and everybody who's here in Southeast Michigan knows about it intimately because Henry Ford, of course, picked up on that and reprinted it in the Dearborn Independent, which he not only published for Michiganders, but he published for Ford dealerships all over the country. So that wonderful piece of anti-Semitism, which was obviously a complete forgery, but it's a forgery framed as the meetings of the big world Jews, I guess the Soroses of that day and the Rothschilds, who, by the way, there's your straight line from the protocols to Marjorie Taylor Greene. Is that her name? There's your straight line right there. She managed, in that space laser beam thing, she managed to get the Rothschilds in there. And I went back and I searched the protocols. I have, we've all got to have a copy of the protocols, right? I searched the protocols and there they are in some of those editions of the protocols. So there's a straight line there. The protocols of the Elders of Zion spoke about how the Jews would conquer the world, the kinds of techniques they would use, how they would re-educate everybody, how they controlled the press, their assaults on religion, their use of loans and credit and so forth to fund authoritarians, et cetera, et cetera. Now, it sounds like if we were to stop here, it would have been a success story for Central Europe. But of course, as we know, it was not a success story for Central Europe because, of course, there was, like there always is with the one step forward, there's the reaction. And so we had the reaction, and the reaction was what political scientists or historians generally call the Romantic Age. Right, which sounds beautiful. It sounds like we're watching Bridgerton on Netflix, but we're not. We're talking about the age in which ideas like blood and soil and race and superiority of certain races began to take hold. They still have. People like to argue we're sort of in a post-nationalist phase. We'll see. But as you can see in America, where no one who was involved in any of this nationalism has any blood soil tie, unless they're from the Ojibwe or one of those First Nations. We still manage to see it, but it's happening in the context too of a great deal of opening up for the Jews. So on one hand, dark forces are gathering, and on the other hand, great freedoms and great enlightenment is occurring. And I don't want to overstate it, but it is not that dissimilar than what we're seeing right now in the United States, where we have these dark forces. If you watch the trial today, you saw that video. I highly encourage you to watch it. There were things I had not seen before, and I thought I'd seen it all. But there were dark forces at the same time that you have people that are speaking about emancipation and for Native people, for all kinds of people of color, woke culture, which I know is on the right is a bad word, but I consider it to be exactly what it is, an awakening to what exactly happened, the true history of the United States. But as always, one is going to take advantage of the other given the right circumstances. And as we know, the right circumstances were there. So while on one hand, it developed slowly and along the same timeline as the development of more tolerance in Germany, as it was becoming increasingly united and so forth, at the same time, the forces of darkness were gathering. And as we know, they they found their moment, right? And you can't compare everything to what happened when, but they found their moment. But it's important to remember that Germany was not the only epicenter of it. France, for all of its enlightenment, was shown to be, demonstrated to be, one of the most anti-Semitic countries. And it was the Dreyfus Affair that brought that to the fore. The Dreyfus Affair, which hopefully you know what it is, but it was basically a French officer of Jewish origin. This fellow Alfred Dreyfus was accused of high treason in 1894. He was put on trial. It was a joke, the trial, but it had an enormous effect on the Jewish world. Looking at this and scratching their heads and thinking that the cradle of enlightenment should be doing better. One of the people that it surprised, probably shouldn't have, was named Theodore Herzl, a completely secular Jew living in Vienna, working for a Jewish newspaper, who came to cover the trial and got it into his head that the Jews were doomed in Europe, and was right about that. Whether he was right about what the solution was, I'll leave to others to argue, or I'll argue about it too, but not tonight, or at least not on this portion of tonight. And of course, we know what was happening in Germany from the mid-19th century forward. Even as emancipation was taking place, so was the increasingly racialized attachment to their national origins, which of course required, as these things always do, the other. And the big other in Central Europe, of course, was the Jew. Wilhelm Maher, if you remember his name from our very first, from our lesson 2 weeks ago, who was, he wasn't really quite he didn't coin the word anti-Semitism, but he popularized it more than anyone. Richard Wagner. Many Jews will not listen to Wagnerian operas because they associate it with his extreme anti-Semitism. He wrote an essay called Judaism and Music. He wrote, the Jew, who, as everyone knows, has a God all to himself, in ordinary life strikes us primarily by his outward appearance, which no matter to what European nationality we belong, as something disagreeably foreign to that nationality. Instinctively, we wish to have nothing in common with them. He really viewed them as Hitler went on to do, as vermin. The table was set, in other words. All right, so that was where anti-Semitism is going to end for now. We know what happened, and I'm not going to really brush on the Holocaust too much, because if there's one thing that I don't think people taking an introductory overview of Judaism need, is to have the details of the Holocaust replayed to them. Dorit just reminded me, the sentence was almost coming out of my mouth, that of course Richard Wagner for a very long time was banned in Israel too. But I don't believe that's true any longer. I remember a concert where he was played at. Anyway, that's where we're going to stop with anti-Semitism. Take a breath. I'll take a glass of water. I did not cover my head to say the blessing like our friend did today. But I feel blessed to have the water. So what we're going to do tonight is for the rest of tonight, and we are going to need next week as well. I don't know if it'll be, so we'll end at 8 o'clock tonight, and we'll continue 2 weeks from tonight, where we'll do the other piece of it. And that's good, because it'll give me a little bit of a chance to talk about this in more detail. The two communities that I want to focus on before we conclude the class, and this is not to the detriment or to the exclusion of European Jews or Australian Jews or Jews in other places, but the American Jewish population and Jews living in the state of Israel, we comprise together about 90% of the Jews in the world. And so for a variety of reasons, it's important to understand our histories, both separately and then later where they cross over. And if we're going to understand or even hope to predict where Judaisms are going in this country or in the future of any country, I think it's really important to spend a little bit of time examining where Israel and American Jewry are and will be, to my thinking, in the future. I don't have a crystal ball. So we'll talk more about that and those kinds of conclusions next week. What I want to do starting now is teach you a little American Jewish history, which is mostly a modern history. Now, the Jews did not come here on the Mayflower, but we didn't come here too much terribly long after the Mayflower. It wasn't a ton of time after the Mayflower. Jews were in the Americas as early as the late 15th century. And that was as a result of possibly crypto Jews, we believe, who were on even Christopher Columbus's boats of hate, whatever you want to call them. But there were Jews there. Some of them to this day have some of these descendants of these crypto Jews, or people who believe they are, have traced their records going back. And I think it was Children of the Expulsion was the movie that I was recommending last time. I think that was the name of the recent one. But Jews were here and beginning to settle in the Americas by the 17th century, because of course they were escaping. And one of the places they escaped was a Dutch colony in Recife, Brazil. And in 1654, that Dutch colony, which had been captured from Portugal, returned to Portugal. And so the Jews, once again, as we've seen in our class about the wanderings, they needed to skedaddle. And they scattered to quite a number of places, mostly throughout the Dutch Caribbean. And if you go to some of these islands today, you can find, and I forget which ones have the more prominent synagogues, but Curacao is one, I know that for sure. The US or British Virgin Islands, I don't remember which one, maybe both. They have some of these as well. These synagogues with sand on the floor. Anybody ever seen pictures of that? But a small boatload of 23 Jews sailed to a much colder area, which at the time was known as New Amsterdam, but which would in some short order be renamed for the Duke of York and become the city that we know the Jews really view as our homeland, at least on this side of the ocean, New York. Now, when they got there, they were not warmly welcomed by the governor. The governor, who Arthur will always remind me is the namesake of the high school he went to, Peter Stuyvesant. Peter Stuyvesant did not love the Jews, and he wrote back to the Dutch West India Company, which was really in control, a letter that said, "We simply cannot give them liberty, for if we do so, then we cannot refuse the Lutherans and the Papists." So he made a bit of a religious argument, but religious pluralism was already part of Dutch culture. It was a silly argument to make, and he lost pretty quickly. In fact, on all matters of intolerance, he was overruled by the Dutch West India Company, which basically only had one goal, and that was to make money. I mean, sometimes that works in our favor. When a corporation says they're no longer going to fund the insurrectionist congressman, I suppose, or when the Dutch West India Company allows the Jews to settle peaceably, all 23 of them, and to establish what became really the first American Jewish community. It was tiny. In 1664, Britain took over. They had not, at this point, had not had a lot of success yet in Britain. It was only when, this is around the time of Cromwell. So they were just being welcomed back into England. But throughout the Americans, throughout these various, the North America, the British America, throughout these areas, these colonies were forming, and they were beginning to make their own rules about who they were going to take and who they would not. And British colonial rule at this time and going forward turned out to be a bit of a mixed bag. But ultimately, the direction kept leading more and more towards tolerance. It really just depended upon where you were. It took until the 18th century before Jews in New York had the right to build a synagogue. and engage in public worship and receive citizenship, naturalization as New Yorkers. Other colonies were much more tolerant, and I bet you can guess the most tolerant of all. And that would have been, of course, Rhode Island, because that was the whole point of Rhode Island. And the congregation in Newport, Rhode Island, has a small but the Toro Synagogue, as it came to be known, a small but glorious moment in American Jewish history that we'll talk about in a minute. New England tended to be dominated by intolerant Puritans, so that was not so great for the Jews. But some areas of the Northeast did become much more comfortable. One of them, notably, and it was actually one of the best places to be a Jew, was Philadelphia. And to this day, the Jewish community of Philadelphia, home to Reconstructing Judaism, the Reconstructionist movement, is very proud of that. The Jewish Publication Society is still headquartered there, as are a number of historical Jewish institutions. Jews also settled in the South. They settled in Georgia, and they settled in South Carolina. And ultimately, it was in Charleston, South Carolina, that we have one of the earliest major Jewish communities in the United States. Ultimately, it would go on to be the home of the first permanent Reform temple in the United States too, a little bit later on. Like everyone else, they fought on both sides when hostilities broke out, and the colonists sent that letter back to jolly old. And so Jews fought on the side of the king, and they fought on the side of America. But in winning independence, American independence, the Jews acquired something that they had never had before. It didn't happen all at once, but it happened fairly quickly, as the United States became the very first country on earth to grant Jews full citizenship and full equality. Now, it doesn't mean there weren't a lot of problems. It doesn't mean there weren't a lot of hesitations here from state to state and place to place, but they were certainly the first major nation to commit to this. Part of that was the fact the United States didn't have an official religion. However you want to parse the separation of church and state, and I think you guys can guess where secular humanistic Judaism stands on that, everyone agreed that you couldn't tell another person what religion they could have. And to this day, that's not the thing we're arguing about. Jews and members of other minority religions were free to dissent from the religious views of the majority without fear of persecution. But as late as 1790, which was a year before the adoption of the Bill of Rights, there were still religious tests for state offices. They had been abolished in the corpus of the main Constitution, but there were still states, Connecticut, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, South Carolina. They even held on to established churches for a few moments and had religious tests. Now, it didn't last very long. The barriers did begin to fall, particularly as the Constitution, the federal Constitution, was ratified. Many states, Delaware, Pennsylvania, South Carolina, Georgia, all dropped their barriers that prevented Jews from voting or from participating in government. It took a lot longer for some others, surprisingly long. Rhode Island, believe it or not, for all its tolerance, once it was established as a state, it did not retain all that tolerance. North Carolina, New Hampshire, but acceptance was more or less the ethos of the land. The notes that I was using, I just passed through them here. I kind of crib on some notes and lectures I give on these topics in other places. And I have to share this with you. Apparently I gave the lecture on this particular set of notes on the day that we inaugurated Trump. And I guess that's the reason, but it's not the only reason that I decided to, in that particular lecture, to remind people of what the reception was of the first president, who, as we know, set the tone for many things in this country. And keep in mind, when I talk about American history and how the Jews fared here, I am absolutely aware, and if I don't mention it often enough, I apologize. I am absolutely aware of what happened to others in this country. and the lies upon which much of our national ethos was built. But I'm also inspired by how the descendants of slaves, of enslaved people, and how the descendants of First Nations, of indigenous Americans, how they have held our feet to the fire, those of us who claimed these privileges before they were ever even imagined for them. So I am absolutely aware that the Jews were a privileged group in this country compared to others. That said, they were coming from places where they were very distinctly not privileged, as you've learned. And I have to believe, and I will continue to believe, that that's one of the reasons that in our large numbers, Jews continue to hold on to these principles and hope that, or at least the ideals, the ideas and the ideals, and hope that they'll be spread to others. So when I read something laudatory from George Washington, it's with full recognition of everything that Washington did, both good and bad, but that's a debate for another time. One of the things that he did that was very good, and there were many things. By the way, if you haven't been to Mount Vernon in many, many years, that is an extraordinary place to visit. And despite the fact that it's not owned by the federal government, because it preceded that, it's owned by a private group, they really make an attempt. We took 3 tours there just on the enslaved people, and women too. Yes, thank you, Elaine. But even Jewish women here, compared to what they were suffering back home, it was a big difference. In 1790, after the adoption of the ratification of the Constitution, the Jewish community of Newport, Rhode Island, which had the synagogue you can still go visit today. I don't know if they don't make these stamps anymore, but it was featured on a stamp. For a long time, Jews, back when we used to have stamps on our letters, Jews used to collect these stamps in large amounts at all of our synagogues and Jewish agencies. I remember for almost a decade using nothing but these stamps at my first Hillels that I was a student and working at. Anyway, it's a picture of this beautiful, well-restored synagogue, the Newport, Rhode Island synagogue, the Toro congregation. Now, there were no rabbis in America at this point. It wasn't a large enough Jewish community. I think at the time of the revolution, there may have been, 300-400 Jews here, maybe a few thousand. It's very hard to know, but certainly in this area, not more than a few hundred. The head of their congregation was what they called in those days a sexton, but in Hebrew a gabbai, a person who sort of tends to the synagogue and has the most Jewish learning. His name was Moses Sesas. And you can hear he's a descendant of the Spanish and Portuguese Jewish community, which was the only one. They had a major synagogue, what became a major synagogue in New York, and they had this synagogue, and all the synagogues here were primarily that we had here, with just a few exceptions throughout the beginning of the 18th century. The end of the 18th century, the beginning of the 19th century, were all Sephardic. So he wrote a letter congratulating Washington on his election as the president of the new republic, et cetera. And what did he say? He said, "Permit the children of the stock of Abraham to approach you with the most cordial affection and esteem for your person and merits, and to join with our fellow citizens in welcoming you to Newport." He was making a tour of the United States, and he went on to talk about the great freedoms and so forth. And Washington replied, and this is something I still get emotional reading this, because knowing Jewish history, there had never been the leader of any nation that had ever spoken to the Jews this way. Not one single time in the history of the diaspora. Now, of course, the United States was a little small backwater nothing. I mean, when we think of Washington, today we think of monuments and cities and this enormously screwed up nation. But back then it was still a country with international recognition, and no leader had ever said anything like this. What did he say? I'm not going to read you the whole letter, but I'll read you some highlights. "While I receive with much satisfaction your address, replete with expressions of affection and esteem, I rejoice in the opportunity of assuring you that I shall always retain a grateful remembrance of the cordial welcome I experienced, etc." from everyone, including you. The reflection on the days of difficulty and danger which are past is rendered the more sweet from a consciousness that they are succeeded by days of uncommon prosperity and security. If we have wisdom to make the best use of the advantages with which we are now favored, we cannot fail under the just administration of a good government to become a great and happy people. He goes on to talk about the basically Enlightenment values that the United States was hoping to spread to the world. I no longer have any attachment to American exceptionalism, but I suppose that this is one of the reasons that people still hold on to that propaganda. But nevertheless, when you hear the next words, and try to hear them from the point of view of an 18th century Jew, a late 18th century Jew, you can understand why the Jews became enamored of and began to dream about this place. He said, "For happily the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens. May the children of the stock of Abraham," using Cessus's words now, "who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while every one shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid." For the President of the United States to repeat back to them their own scripture, which of course he knew very well, it was his too, and to tell them that they had I get a little teary just thinking about it, to tell them that they had no reason to be afraid. That is the first time in Jewish history that any leader of any nation said that to the Jews. And so it's not any wonder that Jews began over the course of the next decades to dream about, as things worsened where they were, coming to what ultimately became known as the Golden Medina to the Yiddish speakers back in Russia in the Pale of Settlement. And I found the number. I'm trying to remember how many American Jews there were at the time. It was 3,000 at the time of the revolution. And yet the president still took time to visit their synagogue and to say this to them. And those words are emblazoned in a lot of Jewish minds to this day. But that was pretty much where the Jewish community of Spanish and Portuguese heritage also kind of ended. Because with only 3,000 Jews in this country and not a lot of leadership, in fact, 0 rabbis and very little organization, very little infrastructure, and a nation to build that mostly included not them, they did not succeed in being fruitful and multiplying. And they ultimately, to a greater and lesser extent, but for the most part, assimilated away. They did not become the basis of the great, large Jewish community that we have today. That started with the second wave of immigration. Now, to call this little group the first wave is a little bit generous to the wave because it really wasn't the wave. It was really just, like when you're in the bathtub and you do that and make the little toy boat move. But this was a wave. This was a true wave. Now, it wasn't the wave that my great-grandparents went through, but this one, which took place between 1820 and 1870, was the first real Jewish immigration to the United States. By 1840, the Jews were but a tiny number of Americans, perhaps 15,000 out of, and these numbers I have written down so I wouldn't forget them, out of 17 million Americans. So you really had to look far and wide before you'd find a Jew. But between 1840 and 1870, 15,000 grew to 200,000. That's growth. And it wasn't all natural. It mostly came from this kind of medium wave, I would say more of a Florida wave than a California wave of Jews who came from primarily Central Europe and Western Europe, right? Mostly from German lands and other Central European areas as well. What caused them in the 1840s and going forward to leave? Well, there were a number of reasons. Chief among them was the fact that the Emancipation was where it had even moved forward was also going backwards. And so they were beginning to feel unwelcome depending on where they lived in many of these areas. There were very restrictive laws at a time when Jews were looking to assimilate. They found themselves now even blocked from assimilation, which is kind of ironic because depending on where you lived in these German areas and Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was much friendlier to them, but had other issues, depending on where you lived, Jews were assimilating at breakneck speed. But they were also doing so at a price. Many of these places only really allowed Jews to enter civic life or higher education or certain businesses by formally converting, even if they didn't really hold them to the religion. Other places really were not interested in welcoming Jews, and still other places, it was just life was tough, and the Jews were otherwise okay, and nothing bad was specifically Jewish, but they had economic hardships. Probably the most notable reason that they moved really had nothing to do with them being Jews qua Jews. It was these revolutions of 1848. This is a fascinating topic all in and of itself. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the weirdness and the timing of these and this was a wave of these revolutions that swept across Central Europe, Central and well, I guess mostly Central Europe at this time, France too, but they widely failed. And the Jews had been in the vanguard of many of these. And when they failed, it was, as I described earlier in the section on anti-Semitism, it really was in favor of an increase in, again, this romanticism of blood and soil and racialism, and now hardcore nationalism of the kind that is easily recognizable to us. And so they decided they wanted to leave for all kinds of reasons. And where, of course, were they going to go? Well, some did go to England, some did go to France, but the vast majority of them, tens of thousands, what ultimately amounted to about 150,000 in total, they went to America. And it was primarily for social opportunity, for them to be free as Jews. And in some cases, Jews who had become great reformers, because the reform movement grew in Germany in certain areas, had found themselves stymied in their ability to continue reforming, owing to the fact that, as they did with the churches, the Catholic and Protestant churches in most of these former lands of the Holy Roman Empire, they did the same with the Jews, having government control over what they could do. And mandatory taxes that Jews had to pay, as did the Catholics and Protestants, to religious councils, meaning that even the pace of reform was being slowed. So some of these people came here to be more Jewish, but the way they wanted to be Jewish. They were seeking Jewish religious freedom when they were constantly being put up against the wall by Orthodox Jews in these places who insisted that the government intervene on their sides. There were stories of really wars in synagogues that were all required to be recognized by the government in many of these places, not every place in Germany, but many of them. Where the Orthodox played some very dirty tricks to make sure that the reformers did not succeed. And many of those reformers, particularly after the 1850s had begun, they came over here as well. Mostly when they came here, they entered the mercantile class. And you'll be able to relate to this in many ways because some of it is still touching our lives today. They were peddlers, they dry goods, clothing, groceries. They settled in large cities where other Germans were because they wanted to be near German culture. Even when they were very Jewish, they wanted to be near German culture. Arthur and I visited the Tenement Museum in New York. Some of you may have been there. One of the places you visit talks about a Jewish family that lived there in the 1870s. But it wasn't a tenement in the way that we think of it then. It was actually nice middle-class housing. And so we learned that this woman was from Germany and ultimately ran into a little bit of a little fortune, and moved to the Upper East Side. And it was when that happened that really things started to go downhill on the Lower East Side when the other Jews came. But they lived where all the other Germans lived. Those tenements were not horrible places to live when they were first built. They were considered lovely housing when they were first built. By about 30 years later, they were garbage. New York, of course, was central to their settlement. Philadelphia was central because of its history. A few places in the South, Charleston was also very important city of settlement. Probably one of the most popular meccas was Cincinnati. Cincinnati was at that time the gateway to the West, and it was super German. And so in that sense, it had what everybody wanted. Chicago was not yet on the rise, and the Jewish community of Chicago was not primarily built by these German Jews. A lot of them went out west. And I don't know if you've ever seen The Frisco Kid, but that is the story of that Jewish community, that Jew from Russia has been called to serve this community, which is so unlike his own. Do you remember the end of the movie? You all know the movie I'm talking about, Gene Wilder and Harrison Ford. You remember at the end of the movie, he shows up, and these Jews don't look like him or anybody else, but he immediately falls in love with the daughter, etc. Well, real Jews moved there too, people whose names we are still wearing on our bums, Levi Strauss being a very good example. They went out to gold rush towns. By the 1850s, the disappointed Enlightenment Jews of Germany were arriving to become the leaders of this new Jewish American group. And that's when we got our first rabbis here. Now, these were not necessarily, we say that many of them were reformers, but remember, there was no reform rabbinical school yet. You were a rabbi. What made you a reformer was usually the fact that you had gone to university. And had gotten a secular education, and many of them weren't reformers. There were some significant ones who were not. In Philadelphia, a modern Orthodox rabbi. We only touched briefly on the differences in the movements, but I think you understand them. A modern Orthodox rabbi, Isaac Leeser, had started up a very major community and a lot of Jewish institutions in Philadelphia. It was in Cincinnati that we had the first attempt to organize all of American Jewry. And ultimately, that became Reform Judaism, but it didn't start out as Reform Judaism. It started out as the idea to create American Judaism. So next week, I think we're going to end now. So I have a full session, not next week, the week after, because I do want to keep it on the 2-week hop. Next week, we have a Tuesday night board meeting. So that's how these were timed. So far, it's worked. We'll meet to finish discussing American Jewish history. And then we will look at Israel and how some of these events in the anti-Semitic Europe and so forth led to the creation of Israel. And then we'll talk about the two communities today, along a little bit with some of the other communities around the world. But basically, given that they take up, upwards of 90% of the Jewish world, these are the two communities that we're going to concentrate on. So thanks for joining me again this week. And I'm happy to have this bonus session with you in too. And I'll see you guys, whoever I don't see before then, I'll see you then. So thank you, everybody.